Welcome to the Centre for Independent Studies for this latest Meet the Researcher lecture. My name is Dr. Jeremy Samet and I'm a Research Fellow here at the Centre. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce my colleague Alex Philipatos. Alex is a Policy Analyst at the CIS, whose research is focused mainly on industrial relations and labour market policy. He's the author of this monograph, which was released at the end of last year, which reviewed the IR changes of the Keating, Howard and Rudd-Gillard federal governments. It examined what improvements to the system are necessary to ensure Australia's workplaces are productive and internationally competitive. Tonight he's going to share with us the findings of a new and soon-to-be released paper which examines the issue of industrial awards. Now, I don't need to tell anybody who's here tonight about how politically contentious the subject of IR policy is. Many Australians are extremely conservative about any proposal to change the IR system, which was established in the first decades of the 20th century. They believe that industrial awards, the linchpin of the arbitration system, are the bedrock of the much fabled fair go, the Aussie fair go. Now, what Alex is going to argue tonight is very counterintuitive. He will argue that the safety net can and will be maintained even if industrial awards are abolished. So without further ado, I will call on Alex to explain to us why industrial awards are the relics of a Byzantine system which we no longer need to worship. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, so over the past 20 years, Australia's labour market has changed significantly. There have been changes to unfair dismissal rules, reforms to industrial action and the role of unions, new rules regarding bargaining, and new agreements for employers and employees. Along with tariff reform, privatisation, deregulation and other reforms of the 1980s era, industrial relations reform was intended to make the Australian labour market more flexible, more productive and more competitive. Unfortunately, despite the changes that have taken place, our industrial relations system is still rooted in the 20th century. The award system that dominated our industrial framework for the majority of the 20th century still wields considerable influence, and not in a positive way. The award system today is supposed to provide a safety net, but in the actual fact, it does a lot more. Awards mandate layers upon layers of minimum wages, restrictions on working conditions and hours, excessive penalty and overtime rates, and mandates for additional allowances. These wages and conditions do not take into account the particular needs of individual businesses or the employer's capacity to pay. As a result, awards raise costs, reduce competitiveness, and hinder employment opportunities. It is high time that the award system be abolished, not only because of the adverse effects on business and workers, but also because it is no longer needed as a safety net anymore. The Fair Work reforms in 2009 brought about a comprehensive set of national employment standards. This safety net applies to all workers and more than adequately provides for the needs of the low paid. The award system today simply provides an even higher minimum wages and conditions on top of this. In my opinion, awards are the relics of a Byzantine IR system. They represent one of the last vestiges of what Paul Kelly describes as the Australian settlement. They need to be abolished to make way for a more flexible and a more productive labour market. Now, since I'm talking about awards today, I should probably start off with a definition. An award sets out minimum wages and conditions for an entire industry. An employer can offer more generous awards than the award, but they can't go below. The award system has changed over the past 20 years as a result of labour market reform. In 1990, almost half the Australian workforce were paid the award wage exactly. Since the Keating government introduced enterprise bargaining, however, employee awards have gradually declined. By 2010, only 15% were paid exactly the award wage. So today, the majority of workers receive wages that are above the award and are set out in collective or individual agreements. And the next slide sort of demonstrates the reduction in the award reliance. So the total is there in blue. I'm sorry if the font is a little bit small. Males in red and females in green. Awards are they're also not spread evenly across the economy. Some industries and occupations are more reliant than others. Award-reliant employees on average tend to be low-skilled and hence low-paid. And the next slide here just breaks down the differences across the occupations. So we want to be looking, if you have a look here, there's more skilled occupations such as managers and professionals. Only 2 to 3% of those are reliant on exactly the award wage, whereas community and personal service sector, sales workers, labourers, they're much more dependent on the award wage. The shift towards bargaining also meant that the awards were supposed to serve a different purpose in the labour market. Rather than setting wages, the award system was supposed to just be a safety net. As such, the yearly wage cases are now called safety net reviews and are focused on, well, at least they're supposed to be focused on the needs of the low paid rather than the needs of the entire workforce. Now, these statistics may show a decline in the relevance of the award system, but they also hide what's really going on. In actual fact, the award system is still highly influential, and there are 4 reasons why. First, awards underpin collective agreements. Any worker on a collective agreement with a union or without needs to be on wages and conditions that are at least as generous as the relevant award. Now, the employer and the workers can make some trade-offs, change the regular working hours, or change the payment structure a little, but every worker has to be better off than they would be on the relevant award. The second reason is that individual agreements must comply with the relevant award to the letter. So no trade-offs, no nothing. You can provide better conditions, but you can't go below. The fact that awards underpin collective and individual agreements mean that whenever there's a change to the award system, such as the annual wage cases or the safety net reviews, the effects flow on to the workers on individual and collective agreements. The third reason that awards are still very influential is that comprehensive collective agreements are actually rare. Many workers simply receive the award conditions and then they have their union bargain them a better wage, and that's it. Some agreements even provide that any pay increase in the safety net review will trigger an automatic and proportionate rise in their wages. This is not how collective agreements were supposed to operate when they were first introduced. They were supposed to be comprehensive and tailored to the needs of the business. Pay increases could instead be tied to productivity improvements, which would create a win-win for the employers and the workers. The fourth, the individual agreements column that I pointed to before, this one here, says it's about 37% of workers covered by individual agreements. It's not entirely what it appears to be. Any worker who is basically employed under the award can be paid an above award wage, and then they'll be considered on an individual agreement. So in actual fact, these 4 points show that despite the statistics, the award system is still very influential. It has a direct impact on 15% of the workforce, their wages, but an indirect impact on at least another 45%, and I'm talking about the collective agreements figure down the bottom there. Perhaps even up to even 70 or 80%. That's the impact of the award system. The effect of the award system has become a little bit more pronounced since the award modernisation process under the Fair Work Act. For those who don't know, as part of the Fair Work reforms, close to 4,000 state and federal awards were simplified down to 122. The problem today is that many of the awards now are much more onerous. Prime Minister Gillard, then the Deputy Prime Minister, made 2 conflicting promises to minimise political backlash. One to employees and one to employers. Workers were supposed to be not disadvantaged, but also employers were not supposed to see costs rise. Now these promises are conflicting, obviously, and in practice only one of them can really be kept. So, when several awards were combined, there was a factoring up of working conditions. Award wages rose, penalty rates increased, and other working conditions became more generous. So today, Modern awards cover the following: base rates of pay and allowances, types of employment, overtime penalty rates, salary and work arrangements, leave loading, superannuation, procedures for consultation and dispute settlement, and outworkers. Now, I don't have time to go through the negatives of all the different types of restrictions, so I'm going to keep my analysis just to cover the important problems. Award wages. The main problem with the award system is its one-size-fits-all nature. It doesn't make sense that two cafes in different shopping strips, or different sizes with different revenue levels, should be required to pay the same wages. Nor does it make sense that employees employed in a clothing store in Adelaide require the same wages as their Sydney counterparts, considering the differences in cost of living. When the new Hospitality Award was handed down a few years ago, Peter Doyle, president of the Restaurants and Catering Australia, remarked that restaurants in New South Wales could see wage costs increase by about 20%. An analysis of the new award, by KPMG demonstrated it could cost up to 8,000 workers. The equal pay for equal work principle applied throughout the award system doesn't take into account differences in local conditions or the employer's capacity to pay. This may not pose a problem for businesses large enough and profitable enough to pay, but those who cannot cope with the additional costs see a decline in their competitiveness. Employers not in a position to pass on the additional costs to consumers via higher prices are forced to reduce the work hours or lay off workers. If there ought to be a minimum wage, and there is a federal minimum wage, then it ought to be low enough to cater for the weakest firms so that any job losses are minimised. Instead, there are layers and layers of wages dictating ever higher burdens on vulnerable businesses, particularly small ones. Another feature of the award system has been the degree to which some employers simply avoid it. It's no secret that the hospitality sector, many employers in the hospitality sector who cannot afford the award wage simply don't pay the award wage. Some of them employ their family, whom they pay what they want, or don't pay them at all, while many more simply hire workers off the books, pay them cash, and they don't get any more entitlements than the cash they received out of the till. But in an odd way, award non-compliance actually helps the system work. It provides jobs to willing workers whom, if it weren't for the illegal activity of their employer, would go jobless. Many of these workers are young, have limited experience, and low skills. These workers are a testament to the burdensome level of the award system. And in recent times, particularly over the last 5 years, award compliance has increased thanks to the work of the Fair Work Ombudsman. And as a result, we've heard more complaints from small businesses about their troubles. Now, the single biggest industry concern in relation to the retail sector, who've been hogging the headlines of recent times, was the impact of penalty rates. Just weeks ago, an application to the Fair Work Commission for a reduction in the penalty and overtime rates in the fast food and retail awards was rejected. And a month ago, a bill to exempt small business employers from penalty rates failed in the Senate. Meanwhile, the effects of a rising Aussie dollar and increased competition, particularly online, have put many businesses in the retail, hospitality and tourism sectors under the pump. To respond, businesses have tried to cut back costs or boost revenue, only to find that the award system was standing in their way. Earlier this year, MasterChef judge George Kalambaris highlighted labour laws as a significant barrier to his hospitality businesses. Specifically on penalty rates, Kalambaris said, "Wages on weekends and public holidays greatly exceed the opportunity for profit. It's really difficult to stay open, and we only do it because of tourism, but the reality is it's uneconomical." This should come as no surprise, since the hospitality sector caters to the consumer's leisure needs, as do the retail, tourism and accommodation sectors. Now, this next slide outlines the penalty rates in the general industry award. Sorry, this one here, you're looking at it already. So, if you're working outside normal hours as a worker, you're getting an extra 25%, same on Saturdays, and on Sundays you'll go up to 100% penalty rate. So if you're one of the lowest, on one of the lowest levels of the general retail award, you're getting $17.50 as your base rate. That goes up to $22 on Saturdays and on the evenings, and that goes up to $35 an hour on Sundays. And on public holidays, you're getting $43.75 an hour. That's just enormous. That's the lowest. If you're at the highest, then you're getting $21.50 normally, $27 on evenings and Saturdays, $29 on Sundays, and on public holidays, even more. So for many businesses in many states, modern awards today, they're simpler, but they're more expensive. The Productivity Commission released a report that notes that before award modernisation, Sunday penalty rates were 50% in the ACT in New South Wales and 60% in South Australia. Saturday penalty rates also used to be 0 in South Australia and 21% in WA. Businesses in these states have seen a significant jump in their weekend wage costs. For many retailers, particularly small ones, operating on Sundays and indeed public holidays is simply not profitable, despite the fact that those times are the periods of high demand by their customers. For those businesses that shut or who operate below their potential employing capacity, opportunities go begging for the employer, the employee, and the consumer. Now, the basic rationale for penalty rates and overtime rates is that employees who work outside the normal span of hours deserve compensation for the inconvenience of working quote-unquote unsociable hours. Work after 5:30 and on weekends is generally deemed to be unsociable as they occupy the times of the day important to the family and for well-being. In reality, though, penalty rates, as the name suggests, were introduced to punish employers who decided to operate during the times the government had reserved for family and leisure. But penalty rates also punish the employees who are willing to work during these hours, but don't get to because the employers cannot afford to pay them. They also penalise consumers who cannot access the services they need because their businesses have shut. Penalty rates and overtime rates represent an outdated perspective on business life in Australia. The nature of work has fundamentally changed. Perhaps more importantly, the demands of consumers have too. Many industries are now expected to operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, particularly when they're competing with online competition. And businesses that cannot stay open during these times that consumers demand will simply struggle to stay in business. In addition, many workers may prefer to work outside regular 9 to 5 hours. I know I did when I was a student. It was the only time I could. Most of them are university or school students, but some of them are simply working in other jobs or who simply prefer a different makeup to their hours. Some depend upon the hours on the weekend because, well, their other activities occupy normal standard hours. These workers do not need additional incentives or additional rewards to do what they otherwise would have done anyway. In the absence of overtime and penalty rates, only those employees willing to work at unsociable times will do so. Employers will be able to hire more workers during these hours, and for those cases where the employer is genuinely unable to attract employees, then it's going to be a strong incentive for them to offer them a little bit of a premium. Now, it's my position that we no longer need awards. Since the reforms of the Fair Work Act, we now have a comprehensive safety net. This safety net sits underneath all awards. It consists of a federal minimum wage, casual loading of 23%, and minimum wages for young workers, as well as the following conditions. You get a 38-hour week, parental and annual leave, personal and carers leave, community service leave, long service leave, public holidays, notice of termination, a few other things. Now, without statutory minimum conditions, like these ones in the National Employment Standards, the award system provided the only form of safety net. Now that the statutory conditions apply to all all employees, the relevant question becomes, is the safety net adequate? Now, the OECD compares comparative statistics on minimum wages, annual leave, and other conditions that form the work-related entitlements of the safety net. Relative to other developed countries, rich ones, Australia has a high minimum wage and generous work entitlements. The federal minimum wage in Australia is currently $15.96 an hour and represents 54% of the median wage. In 2011, Australia's real minimum wage ranked fifth highest among 23 of the world's richest countries. And the award system builds further minimum wages and conditions on top of this. And this next slide shows how we compare. So Australia's there in the red. Once again, I'm sorry about the small title, the small font. So while we might be fifth highest, it's quite possible that if we took a weighted average of all the employees who work underneath the award or pay the award wage, Australia could quite possibly go to the top of the list. Australia also has comparatively generous leave entitlements, as I said before. A study by Mercer in 2011 showed that Australia's leave entitlements compare quite favourably against other OECD countries. Australian employees receive, on average, 20 workdays of annual leave per year and 10 paid public holidays. These entitlements compare favourably against several other OECD countries, such as the US and Canada. The average among OECD countries is roughly 21 annual leave days and about 10 public holidays, which places Australia the slightest bit below the mean. Now, these statistics compare only a couple of variables. There are, of course, additional entitlements in the National Employment Standards, as there are in other countries. Nevertheless, the facts support the case that statutory minimum conditions in Australia are sufficient, enough to cater for the needs of the low paid. So if the safety net is sufficient and a minimum wage is generous, then there is no need for an additional set of minimum wages and conditions. So long as the employers are offering wages higher than the federal minimum, the rest should be a matter of negotiation. Similarly, if employers are complying with the minimum employment conditions, 38-hour week, the rest of that, they ought to have the ability to set the rest of their workplace arrangements to suit the business. If employees prefer more generous conditions, they have the ability to shop around at other workplaces or solicit the representation of a union. To sum up, the award system today has significant influence despite the introduction of enterprise bargaining and despite the reforms of the last 20 years. Though only 15% of workers are paid at the exact award rate, award wages still have an indirect impact on a large proportion of the workforce. Award conditions such as penalty rates and overtime and restrictions on working hours still affect the vast majority of businesses. Award wages and penalty rates increase costs for businesses, erode their competitiveness, and reduce employment opportunities for workers and small businesses. Small businesses and unskilled workers tend to bear the brunt of it because low-skilled workers are usually the last employed and the first dismissed. An efficient and fair labour market regime should provide minimum standards and leave the rest to employers and employees, or their unions, to negotiate on. This ensures that wages and employment conditions are tailored to the needs of the businesses concerned, so that those businesses can in turn provide the greatest opportunity to the greatest number of workers. The award system today is outdated and redundant. Future labour market reforms should seek to abolish the award system in favour of existing federal minimum wage and statutory conditions. Thanks.
First question is, why did the Gillard government legislate these national employment standards when, for the reasons you've outlined, it does undermine the rationale for awards? And second question is, what would this, if it was a non-awards based industrial relations system and negotiations were based on individual workplaces, what would the system look like? And I mean in terms of, would it look like the New Zealand system, the UK system, the Swedish system?
Well, it wouldn't look like the Swedish system. The Swedish system is quite regulated. It would probably a little bit more like the New Zealand system. A couple of other areas of our industrial relations system are similar. But New Zealand once had awards, and then they got rid of them in 1991 with the Employment Contracts Act. So I would think it would be somewhat similar to their system. And your first question was about
Why the national employment standards?
why the national employment standards. Well, not every single worker is actually covered by an award. In fact, I'm not covered by an award. There are some industries that there simply wasn't a union to create an award, and so there historically has never been an award. And so the national employment standards were to capture everyone there, and also to set a minimum for the award system. So the award modernisation process was actually part of the work choices reforms that never got done because Howard ran out of political capital. And so Gillard has picked up Howard's ball and run with it, and the only difference has been that where a Howard government may have made the safety net a little bit less onerous on employers, not so under the Fair Work Act. Although, sorry, actually no, go ahead. Yep.
John?
John Stone. Look, first of all, I should say it's an admirable presentation, a lot of information in it, which is very useful to have. But I think there's a general point to be made about this, and indeed a lot of other such presentations by CIS and other such bodies. They're academically usually fairly impeccable. In terms of what I might call a political approach to getting something done, I think they suffer from a good many defects. Now, I don't want to nitpick, but I can illustrate this by just a couple of things in that slide and similar things on a lot of other slides. You see, the second thing there says, penalty and overtime rates are reducing opportunities for business and employment. Forget business. Nobody cares about whether reducing opportunities for business. It should say penalty and overtime are reducing opportunities for jobs. And use a word like jobs, not employment. It's one syllable, not three, is it? Anyway. You begin to lose the argument once you have sentences like that rather than simpler sentences which focus on the main issue in people's minds are jobs. They don't, as I say, business people care about business, of course, but most people around the committee in a political sense don't, or at least they don't think about it.
Sure.
Take the next one. Australia's statutory safety net is already generous by international standards. It's not generous, it's oppressive by international standards. It locks people out of the labour market. It's oppressive on disadvantaged, on uneducated people, on physically or otherwise disadvantaged people, on Aboriginals in particular as a category of people. And to talk about it in that way, I think, is going 180 degrees in the wrong direction. It's part of that particular sentence is part of a much wider debate, which you can no doubt pick up in other questions, about the whole role in the community of the minimum wage, which is only one of the many awards, as you've been talking about. Minimum wage is a disgrace, and it ought to be held up as a disgrace for what it does to employment opportunities for otherwise people who would like to work, but who are not up to producing productive results for employers at the wages that employers are required to pay them.
Well, I think on the last part about minimum wages, one of the things that's one of the arguments that's commonly levelled against those who believe in free labour markets is that there is somewhat of a disconnect between some of the evidence regarding minimum wages and their effect on employment conditions is somewhat ambiguous. I only think that happens because employers who can't afford the minimum wage simply don't pay it. On your they employ workers off the books. On your point about penalty rates costing jobs, they may cost jobs for some workers, but for other workers, if they're not getting a job, if they're not getting work on a Saturday or a Sunday, they may still be getting work during the weekdays. So it might actually be, in some cases, incorrect for me to say that it is costing a job whereas it's rather just costing them a shift. So I know it's one of those statements that you don't want to make incorrect. You don't want to make a statement and then be pulled up on its validity. So I take your point.
Once again, thank you for an interesting talk. You showed enough data that the number of workers coming within the award system is steadily decreasing.
Sure.
And it's only about, 15% or so now. So I would assume that in a non-distant future, if I extrapolate all those graphs, there won't be anyone.
Not necessarily. No, it depends upon how...
It'll be
depends upon those
insignificant.
award rates.
It'll
Not
be
necessarily.
insignificant. I mean, if you see the trend of the graph. So that's not my
Yeah,
question,
the
though.
trend of the graph has gone down.
Yeah.
Some
But that's not my question, though.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say that the award system is it's a bit like the current government. It's only a matter of time, in my view. You don't agree, but we don't know. We have to wait and see. But anyway, now my question really is, all those data that you showed, where you said Australia is fifth highest, etc., and one of those.
Minimum wage.
Yeah. I wonder whether this uses the nominal exchange rate or the exchange rate on purchase power parity, because you have to do that. Otherwise, it will be misleading.
It's the real hourly minimum wage, purchasing power parity terms.
So it is based on PPP?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
That's why it's not...
Okay. Now, otherwise it could be quite misleading.
Sure, I should have...
Yeah.
No, you're right.
Okay, now you can comment about the award being going insignificant or whatever. Thank you.
The statistics that are released on the proportion of workers employed under the award or collective agreements or individual agreements are released every 2 years. Now, for 2012, it still hasn't been released yet. But some estimate that award coverage has actually gone up as a result of award modernisation. So I wouldn't necessarily say that because the trend has gone down, it'll continue to go down. It depends upon the wages that are imposed under the awards, which have gone up as a result of award modernisation, and again at around the same time from the National Minimum Wage Review. So the trend is down, but I wouldn't be surprised if the next lot of data to come out would show it increase at the same time.
I have a couple of questions. I don't see I don't see Germany on there. And secondly, where would Australia be placed if the rate to the US dollar was 80 cents instead of where it is at the moment?
It's purchasing power parity. So it's a relative purchasing power. So real wages rather than nominal wages. So they're given in US dollars, but it takes into account the effects of inflation in either country. So it's not a flat calculation of nominal wages in each country and the nominal exchange rate.
But where is Germany? That's the first question. The second question is, has any research been done into the extent to which Australia's productivity per man-hour worked relates to our working terms and conditions, and how does that compare? And can we determine a relationship between the various factors that you've brought to account and productivity?
Yeah, there has been a fair bit of work, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years, on the effects of deregulating the labour market, or enterprise bargaining, I should say, and productivity. And none of the evidence I've seen in the academic community, and even in the Productivity Commission's reports, is able to discern a link between labour market deregulation and productivity. Now, there was a big productivity boost in the 1990s, and that happened at the same time that there was deregulation of the labour market. But because there are so many determinants that impact the level of productivity in the economy, the amount of capital that each worker uses, technological advancement, which we had the tech boom in the 90s. There is a lot of doubt over whether it was, in fact, the reforms of the 90s that spurred productivity. So I don't doubt that there is a relationship between the two, but no one has been able to find a clear link between workplace reform and productivity changes.
I was just wondering if you had any idea how many people are employed off the books.
Oh. That's an interesting one.
Go up to Chatswood and have a look.
No, I haven't found any statistics on that. The Workplace Ombudsman deals on these cases on a case-by-case basis, but I haven't found any estimates of the total amount. It would be good. It would be good just to find in the hospitality and restaurant sector, where I imagine it would be quite high.
There was changes in the Fair Work to right to union entry and all that. Has that had any impact? Is that what unions are currently looking at?
Well, unions...
Or are they keen not to actually draw attention to this issue?
Well, unions in the past have been tasked with policing the award, and for a lot of small businesses, they simply let it slide. Now, that could be either quite a few reasons. One, they may not have the capacity to police all the awards in all the small businesses. Two, that's not where their members are, so they're not going to gain any additional membership by doing that too. So their incentive to police the smaller companies isn't really as high as it is in the larger companies. So I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were talking about. In terms of union right of entry, there has been an increase in union rights for right of entry, and particularly in the mining sectors, where unions have been cut out in the last 20 years, they are starting to get more influence, particularly with the Fair Work Act's majority support determination, which is where if a majority of workers prefer or want to be bargaining with the union, then they can force the employer to do that. Whether that's had an increase on award compliance, I don't think there's a relationship. And they haven't had an increase in membership. So I'm not sure whether those extra rights given to unions are really going to have a large effect just yet.
What do you think the chances are of something like awards being abolished from a political perspective? Obviously, we saw with work choices at a previous election, there was a massive union campaign, and that caused a significant drop in votes for what you might describe as pro-business parties.
Sure.
Is there any chance that the abolishment of awards could be taken up from a political perspective?
Maybe in about 3-4 election cycles. The coalition has announced that they're going to be announcing their reforms within a matter of weeks rather than months. What we do know is there is going to be an inquiry into unions. We know that there's going to be, I think, a little bit of a clampdown on right of entry abuse, but there isn't going to be anything to do with individual agreements. They haven't tabled anything in terms of reforming the award system, and they have tabled, or they plan to have an inquiry by the Productivity Commission. So if a coalition government gets elected nationally, I would not expect any large reform in the first term, and any reform that takes place in the second term is entirely dependent upon what the Productivity Commission says. I personally don't think there's much political appetite at all for eliminating the awards. I think it'll be seen as stripping workers' rights, and that's it, not as creating more jobs.
But your argument is the government should be opposed to that, which is why it's important.
That's exactly right. So, I mean, I honestly don't understand. But I think the general populace, if they knew that they were covered by the national employment standards, and my guess is a lot of them probably just don't. They remember the award. They understand that the award is there as their safety net, and they probably think that that's all there is.
You didn't mention casual workers.
Sure.
Many of these people who are
20%
employed
of the
rather
workforce.
20. Did you mention it?
No, but it's 20%.
Oh, that's reasonably high. The other thing is contract workers too, who are paid to do a job, and it's
Sure.
up to them to get the job done within the number of hours, or if it takes longer, they don't get any more money.
Sure, they're not covered by awards at all.
No.
No. So it's they're counted as a business, I suppose, not rather than employees.
Mm.
Do you have any information on the 15% that are covered by awards, what the breakdown is between the public and the private sector? Because one suspects the weighting is enormously, there is a huge tendency for the public sector to be award regulated and the private sector not so much. Is that basically the situation?
There are some statistics, and they show roughly 96% of the public sector workforce. This is in 2008, because after 2008 they stopped breaking it down by public and private, and they started breaking it down. They started breaking it down by part-time and full-time instead. So the statistics I have are 2008, and they show that about 96% of the workforce the public sector workforce are covered by collective agreements. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not covered by the awards. As I was saying before, every worker that is covered by a collective agreement, there's an award sitting underneath that, and then there's the national employment standards under that. So,
So with a collective agreement, does the individual earn a pay rate that is greater than the award minimum?
it needs to be at least the award minimum. Higher, no problems, but at least the award minimum.
You did mention in your talk that New Zealand, they have got rid of award sometime in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And you also said as an answer to one of the questions saying that you think it's going to be rather hard in Australia. You said 3 or 4 election cycles and so on.
Yeah,
so I just wonder, what was the circumstance in New Zealand that led to this abolition of awards, and because there are many things, these two countries are similar in their institutions and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just curious, if you have any idea, then perhaps I'd like to hear it.
Yeah. Why was it possible in New Zealand?
Yeah, what were the circumstances at that time?
Well, no, the Employment Contracts Act was undertaken by the Conservative government, or the right of centre government over there, and then was later reformed back again. So they've had a similar trajectory, but they've gotten rid of awards. There's been a shift to the right with the Employment Contracts Act, where they abolished the awards and simply said negotiate the rest of it, individual or collective agreements. Then a Labor government got in and reformed that to get rid of individual agreements. So they didn't look to reimpose the award system. No, they didn't reintroduce it. And perhaps there just wasn't the political will for it. Perhaps there was a little bit more of an understanding that you don't necessarily need an award system for to have a safety net. And so, but I'm honestly, I don't know exactly why it's possible in New Zealand but not here. Well, it's not necessarily not possible here, but I don't see it as foreseeable in the near future.
I would suggest that, being an ex-Kiwi myself, I would suggest that the reason was pure and simple economic necessity and possibly economic survival. However, as far as minimum wages are concerned in New Zealand, it does exist, and in fact, I do know that the New Zealand Labor opposition have a proposal to increase the minimum wage significantly, which the New Zealand government under John Key is resisting for pretty obvious reasons, going to affect jobs.
Sure. Similar a similar, not exactly the same, but there was at the New South Wales Labor Conference an idea to get rid of youth wages, which is sort of a similar thing, and replace them with the adult wage. And I'm not sure if something like that happened similar, but I remember reading something about the youth wages in New Zealand being abolished and replaced by the adult rate, which precipitated a very high increase in unemployment. I can't remember the exact stats right now, but
there's a tremendous amount being said all the time about productivity.
sure.
Do you think this whole system that you're describing is going to come under enormous pressure as there are more and more independent contractors and people doing highly productive work, choosing to do it completely outside the scheme?
Do I think that'll have an
Yes,
increase?
I want, and there's another word I'd like to use, which is that behind all this colossal infrastructure controlling wages, there seems to be a terribly infantilizing message to someone who is, going out trying to do a good job and make their own way in the world, when these arraigned layers of people depend for employment on actually setting, a penny here, a cent there, and this kind of stuff. I remember a year or two ago, I think it took them 18 months to decide whether school children should be allowed to work for an hour and a half after school. I mean, what the hell is going on?
It's part of the working restrictions or mandates of the awards in the retail industry, hospitality industry. It's a minimum 3-hour working shift. And
I'm sorry, I started out by asking you, do you think this is really survivable, or do you think it will go away?
do I think it will go away? Eventually, I think so. I think eventually the case will be made for, maybe we won't be able to get rid of awards too quickly, but I think there is more momentum, particularly in the business community, for lowering penalty rates, getting rid of working restrictions like the ones you were talking about, minimum shift times for young workers. I think there is some political momentum for that, and I would think that those would be the first things to move. There will be change, but it's a matter of time.